After my family took over my house and tried to push me out of my own room, I kicked them all out. I am a 26-year-old who lives with my parents in a home that I fully pay for. Although it sounds rather simple, it's much more intricate than that. I'll begin at the beginning. Last year, I purchased a home in the city. I pay for everything, including food, all of the bills, and the entire mortgage. Not a single penny is paid by my parents, Liz, 55F, and Tom, 55 meters, who are both retired teachers. Nor was it a case of moving back home because I couldn't afford rent. As a software developer, I actually earn a nice living, and I wanted to be nearer to employment options in the city. In addition, I felt that after they had supported me for years, it would be good to return the favor. It's a pleasant 3-bedroom home with a large living room and a backyard. It's nothing fancy, but comfortable. I claim the master bedroom because I pay for everything. It has its own bathroom and a walk-in closet, which is a big plus because I detest having to share a bathroom. Since I spend around 80% of my time working from home, I set up my home office in the 2nd bedroom with 2 monitors, a comfortable chair and all the supplies I need for family visits. The 3rd bedroom was kept as a guest room. Everything was wonderful at first. While I worked and took care of the house, my parents, who were glad to be in the city, went about their own business. Since they were my parents and I felt good about supporting them after everything they had done for me, I didn't mind paying the bills. Then, however, a change occurred. My mother casually dropped a bombshell during breakfast. One morning, my older brother Jake, 28 meters, and his wife Emma, 26F, were considering relocating to the city. She said they have reportedly been having difficulties and Emma is pregnant. They really need the help, she added. At first I didn't give it much thought. I thought that if Jake and Emma relocated, they would find a tiny apartment close by, but they have a history of jumping from one horrible circumstance to another. Things took a turn for which I was unprepared. At that point, a few days later, my mother sat me down and, in her most innocent voice, informed me that Jake and Emma had been invited to remain with us, albeit only temporarily, until they were able to get back on their feet. They didn't ask if I was comfortable with this, though. Oh no, they informed me after inviting them. Jake and Emma arrived with their luggage in hand, obviously intending to remain for the duration. While I was still processing the entire situation, the deal is this. As soon as Jake and Emma moved in, it was obvious they had no intention of leaving. I'm already anxious about the additional costs I'll have to pay. Now that I have 2 more people to support without anyone asking how I feel, I'm paying for everything. Groceries, utilities, the mortgage, etc. Although I like my brother, Jake isn't the most responsible person. He always gets himself in a predicament where everyone else has to save him. Emma seems decent enough, but I don't like her entitled attitude, which makes me feel like everyone should take care of her because she's expecting. Almost instantly, the tension began to rise. Emma began making these innocuous sounding remarks a few days after they moved home, but they are really bothersome. For example, this place is so big, it must be hard for you to clean it all by yourself. Or, when the baby stuff arrives, we're going a lot of space. At first, I didn't give it much thought. However, things became more heated. One evening, Emma and Jake drew me away and said they needed a conversation. I hoped they would give financial assistance or perhaps apologize for the additional strain they were placing on me. However, no. So we've been thinking it would make more sense if we took the master bedroom, explains Emma in a relaxed tone. Jake interrupted. Yeah, the baby's going to need a lot of stuff, and your room has the walk-in closet and I blinked, thinking I could have misheard. Let me remind you, these 2 were sitting here, recommending that I give up my own room for them and their unborn child, even though I pay the mortgage and everything else. I was suddenly struck with boldness. I said, why don't you just take the guest room? While maintaining my composure. It's quite large. Emma looked at me, as if I had just made a ridiculous suggestion. There isn't a walk-in closet in that room, she stated. The infant will require room. I was finished. I refused to give up my room. You can either locate another place to stay or use the guest room. Jake was somewhat taken aback, as if he was surprised that I wasn't simply giving in. However, Emma was blatantly insulted. I realized then that things weren't going to work out. Things quickly started to go south. I observed Jake and Emma become quite at ease over the course of the following few days. Their belongings were all over the place, with baby magazines strewn on the dining table and shoes kicked off by the couch. Emma even began discussing the crib's location as if she had already made up her mind that they would remain in the master bedroom. I had to attend a meeting in the office one day. For the remainder of the night, the house was strangely quiet. Nobody tried to quarrel with me or knock on my door. They must have realized, at last, that I was no longer playing around. They didn't deserve to reside in my home if they didn't. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. First update. I was hoping for a dramatic outburst, or for everyone to finally take me seriously once I handed out the eviction papers. Rather, there was an uncomfortable silence in the home. Due in part to my inability to fall asleep, I woke up earlier than usual the following morning. I was waiting for a certain event. Perhaps my parents would try to persuade me, or Jake might knock on my door and insist that I change my decision. However, none of that took place. The house was deserted when I woke up and entered the kitchen. No parents, no Emma, and no Jake. I even wondered, wishful thinking I suppose, if they packed up and departed in the middle of the night. I waited for someone to say something, anything at all. While I sat at the table and made my coffee, I had no desire to engage in small talk or repeat my explanation. I wasn't going to back down now that I'd drawn my line. I couldn't continue living that way. They had pushed me too far. They showed me no respect, and they certainly showed no respect for the fact that I was footing the bill. My mother eventually entered the kitchen. She appeared to have had little sleep. She simply got a cup of coffee and sat across from me without saying anything. At first, it was strange that neither of us knew how to respond to the awkward silence. The stillness was finally broken by her. She spoke softly and wearily. "Honey, I know things have gotten out of hand." I just stared at my coffee and waited for her to continue, without saying anything. Even though I knew she would have to apologize in some way, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. She went on, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't realize how bad things had gotten between you and your brother. I guess I didn't see how unfair it was to you. We were just trying to help them." I was surprised by that. At least not this quickly. I didn't think she would confess. I briefly believed that perhaps she was finally realizing that I wasn't the bad guy in this scenario. However, I was still unable to get over my irritation with all that had transpired. With a stronger tone than I meant, I responded, "You didn't just ignore what I wanted. You always took his side, as if you thought I would give in and let them have whatever they wanted." She stared down at her coffee for a few seconds before speaking. "I understand," she muttered. "However, we reasoned that you've always been the more resilient one. He has never had it easy, Jake." She always used that as an excuse. Jake required more help. He wasn't strong, and he had struggled more. Since I was the one with my life together, it seemed as though they didn't believe I had any boundaries. "You also believe that I've had it easy?" With my rage seething just below the surface, I asked. "This residence was purchased by me. The mortgage is paid by me. The groceries are paid for by me. Do you really believe that I can continue carrying you all indefinitely?" She nodded and groaned. "You're correct. We couldn't have asked for more from you. However, Jake, the baby, is on the way." I interrupted her. "The baby is not the point of this. You guys haven't shown me any respect, and this is about that." She looked tired as she sighed once again. "We believed we were acting appropriately," she ultimately stated. "Emma and Jake don't have much. And who is to blame for that?" I fired back. "I didn't request that they move in. None of this was requested of me. You can't keep saving them by putting me in a bad position. They need to learn how to live their own lives." She seemed to finally comprehend, or at least attempt to. As she nodded, she said, "We'll figure something out," in a softer tone. "But don't push us away, please. Not in this manner." I tried to relax and sat back. Since they were my parents, I didn't want to expel them. However, I also couldn't continue to live this way. They would have to leave if things didn't change. I said, as quietly as possible, "I don't want to push you out. However, things must change. I can't continue to be treated like I don't belong in my own home." She simply nodded silently, without arguing. "All right," she said, "we'll find a solution." She then walked out of the kitchen, leaving me to think alone once more. At least it seemed like they were beginning to take me seriously, even though I wasn't sure if anything would actually change. When Jake eventually arrived later that afternoon, he appeared to have been holding his rage all day. He simply dropped down across from me in the living room, wearing the same angry look he had worn ever since I delivered him the eviction notice. Without saying hello or anything else, I also remained silent and focused solely on my phone. "So this is how things will be?" At last, he spat, his voice dripping with resentment. "Are you really going to expel us?" I hardly raised my gaze. "I gave you a day. I'm going to contact the police if you're still here tomorrow." Jake snorted and shook his head as if I were the villain. "We're related. You don't treat your family like this." I reclined back in my chair and placed my phone down. "Yes, family members also don't take advantage of one another. Do you really think you can just take over my house after weeks of freeloading without doing anything? Jake, I'm not your backup plan. After that, he didn't say much. For a minute, he sat there, obviously wanting to dispute, but he ran out of things to say. He understood I wasn't bluffing because I had outlined my criteria. Jake stood up, mumbling to himself, and went off again after a few more uncomfortable moments of stillness. Jake was typical, always fleeing when he didn't get his way. Almost too peacefully, the remainder of the day went by. Even though I had no idea what Jake and Emma would do, I wasn't going to change my mind. They had more than enough time to work things out, yet all they had done was snoop me. Everything would be decided in the following 24 hours. Second update, I got up early once more on the morning of their eviction deadline. I was aware that today would either be the day Jake and Emma moved out or compelled me to file a lawsuit. Oddly enough, I no longer felt angry. I didn't even feel nervous. The only thing left to do was to follow through on what I had already recognized had to happen. The home was still eerily quiet when I woke up and went into the kitchen. Almost like the quiet before a storm, it felt different. Even though the refrigerator was still very empty from Jake and Emma's most recent grocery run, I prepared myself some. I was able to pull together enough money for a good supper, and as I ate, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had gotten out of hand. It was all right only a few months ago. I was doing well with my parents. Life was wonderful. I was working, and I was paying my expenses. Everything went haywire when Jake and Emma arrived. When individuals begin to feel entitled to things they didn't earn, it's amazing how quickly things can shift. I heard footsteps in the corridor a few hours later. After entering the kitchen and getting a cup of coffee, my dad took a seat at the table across from me. At first, he sipped his coffee and gazed out the window without saying anything. I couldn't tell whether he was upset with me or simply unsure of how to respond. The silence was finally broken by him. He muttered, "Jake and Emma are leaving today." I took a while to reply. Although I felt awful about it, I knew that this was the proper thing to do. I couldn't continue to allow them to exploit me, and if it meant they had to go, then so be it. With a quiet voice, my dad remarked, "They have nowhere to go. Until they work things out, they will be staying at a hotel for a while." Mid-bite, I paused and turned to face him. I did experience some guilt, but I pushed it away right immediately. They hadn't done anything to help themselves, even though I had given them plenty of time to get their act together. I said in a firm voice, "I gave them a chance. They gave me no other option." My father did not quarrel. He simply nodded and took another sip of his, without attempting to guilt trip me as I had assumed he would. I believe he eventually realized that this time, I wasn't going to back down. We couldn't return to the way things were after everything that had transpired. Jake and Emma began packing their belongings at lunchtime. I spent the majority of it in my room because I didn't want to argue with anyone else or hear more passive-aggressive remarks. However, I knew something was going to happen when I heard Jake's voice growing louder from down the corridor. After a time, Jake did really knock on my door. He was standing there with the same irate expression he had had since the beginning of this whole situation. When I opened it, "Are you really going to allow this to occur?" His voice was stern as he inquired. "You're simply going to dismiss us in this manner?" I leaned against the doorframe with my arms crossed. "I gave you a day. You were aware of what had to occur." Jake clenched his jaw, obviously attempting to control his rage. "Dude, we're family. You don't treat your family like this." I inhaled deeply, while attempting to maintain my composure. "Families do not exploit one another. I won't throw you out without cause. For weeks, you have been wasting your time here without making any contributions. I've been covering everything, including the groceries and the mortgage, and you attempted to evict me from my own home and seize my room instead of showing gratitude. I will not allow that to occur." For a few seconds, Jake remained silent. He was obviously furious, but he had nothing more to dispute about. Even though he didn't want to acknowledge it, he knew I was correct. "That's it then." At last he muttered in a quiet voice, "You're simply dismissing us." I answered, "I'm giving you the same option I gave you yesterday. You have two options. Either move somewhere else, or respect my personal space by remaining in the guest room. However, you're going to leave if you're unable to accomplish it." Jake gave me one last look, then turned and left without saying anything else. I took a deep breath and shut the door. Although I knew it had to be done, the entire scenario had been draining. Jake and Emma had left by mid-afternoon. Sincerely, I didn't want to watch them go, so I didn't. A dramatic farewell was unnecessary. Without a word to me, they packed up their belongings, put them in their car and drove away. After they left, the house was calmer and less tense. For the remainder of the day I didn't hear much from my parents. They were probably still assimilating everything that had transpired. Despite her outward signs of stress, my mother remained silent. Perhaps she now understood that Jake and Emma had pushed me too far, and this was the outcome, and that I wasn't the cause of it all. My mother knocked on my door. That night, she entered, took a seat on my bed's edge, and gazed at the floor. For a long time, she was clearly struggling to find the proper words. She whispered, "They're gone." Without a word I nodded. She said, "I never thought it would get to this point. I was unaware of the amount of pressure we were placing on you." I felt some of the frustration subside as I gazed at her. I tried to defend my position by saying, "It's not that I didn't want to help. However, you guys treated me as if my needs and personal space weren't significant." She nodded and groaned. "You're correct. We ought to have noticed it sooner." For several minutes, neither of us really knew what to say next, so we sat in silence. Although I could tell she was upset, at least she now appeared to get my point. After a while, I broke the stillness and said, "I don't want you and Dad to leave, but I can't continue living this way if things don't change." She stood up slowly and nodded once more. "We'll work it out," she said. "I promise. Things will be different." I experienced an odd mixture of relief and fatigue as she walked out of the room. There was still work to be done with my parents, but the matter with Jake and Emma was finally resolved. Even though I knew it wouldn't be simple, at least they seemed open to listening now. I felt as though I could breathe for the first time in weeks. The house was silent. Although it wasn't a flawless solution, I was at least able to regain my privacy and, more significantly, my respect. The house fell into a spooky silence when Jake and Emma left. Although I felt as though I could breathe at last, the incident continued to nag at the back of my mind. Even though I had won the fight for my room and my respect, I still questioned whether or not my relationship with my parents would ever truly return to normal. There was no turning back after I had drawn a firm line. Nevertheless, I thought that we could manage to proceed without all of the stress. The following days were peaceful, almost too quiet. My parents were largely private. Occasionally, my mother would say something courteous, but we never discussed the incident. My dad, who has always been the more reticent one, seems to completely avoid any confrontational situations. I wasn't sure if they were still processing everything that had happened or if this was their way of giving me space. In any case, I was fine with the silence. In order to avoid thinking about anything, I threw myself into my work in my home office for the majority of the day. Now, the office served as both my haven and my escape from the turmoil of the previous several weeks. However, I would occasionally catch myself reflecting on how things had transpired. Even though I knew I had made the correct decision, I couldn't help but feel a little awful about how everything had gone so wrong. Something had to give because I had been taken advantage of for far too long. A week or so following Jake and Emma's departure, my mother entered my office as I was working. She seemed to be thinking about something, judging by the way she hovered at the entrance. "Are you free for a moment?" Her voice was strangely gentle as she inquired. I turned to her and nodded, saving my work. "What's going on?" She nervously wrung her hands as she entered the room. "Everything has been on my mind, including Jake, Emma, and our treatment of you." I remained silent so she could talk. She seemed to have something she wanted to talk about. Her voice cracked slightly as she said, "I just wanted to say that we didn't mean to make you feel like you didn't matter. We believed that we were assisting Jake, but now I realize that we were overburdening you. We took advantage of the fact that you have done more for us than we could have ever dreamed. I apologize." I was taken by surprise by the apology. Although I had anticipated some sort of recognition soon, it was more painful for hear her express it so bluntly. Her honesty was evident in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I had the impression that she genuinely knew how I was feeling. I tried to speak steadily as I said, "Thank you, Mom. However, it was more than simply the house or the money. Respect was at issue. I had the impression that none of you respected me or the work I was doing to keep things going. Although I didn't mind assisting, I couldn't continue to live like this." She wiped a tear from the corner of her eye and, "You're correct. We ought to have honored your personal space. It won't occur once more." Long, emotional chats weren't my thing, but this one felt essential. I felt as though a burden had been removed, and I could now envision a way forward free from ongoing conflict and animosity. I got a little regretful grin from my mom, and she went back to the kitchen. For several minutes, I sat there, taking in what had been spoken. Although it was not a turning moment, by that time, a new routine had been established in the house. The unpleasant atmosphere that had pervaded every room since Jake and Emma's departure had gradually subsided, and my parents were more considerate of my personal space. After living in a battle zone For the past few months, I could finally feel the house turning back into a home. My dad was seated at the kitchen table one evening, looking especially serious when I got home after an office meeting. Typically, my dad preferred to most of the hard talking to my mom. However, I could tell he had something significant to say by the way he was sitting and looking into his coffee cup, trying to keep things informal. I said, "Hey," and got a drink out of the refrigerator. "Is everything all right?" His countenance was contemplative as he looked up. "I've wanted to speak with you." Curious but not really concerned with what he had to say, I took a seat across from him, leaning forward with his hands clasped in front of him. He inhaled deeply. "About the house and all of your efforts to maintain this place." I remained silent since I could tell he needed to vent. His voice was low as he started. "I realize I haven't said much. However, I've given it a lot of thought. I want you to know how much I appreciate all that you have done for this family. More than any of us could have ever imagined." I was surprised. Hearing my dad speak those words felt important because he wasn't the kind to open up like this. He went on, "You've carried more than your fair share, and you didn't ask for any of this. I apologize for the way things ended between Jake and Emma, and I just wanted to let you know that I see it." It struck me differently when he acknowledged everything I had gone through than when my mother apologized, because I could see he had been holding on to this for some time. Although neither meant more than the other, my dad's reserved demeanor somehow gave his remarks a deeper meaning. I said, "Thanks, Dad," since I was at a loss for words. "That is very significant." He took another sip of his coffee and nodded. "All I want is for things to improve for everyone." Although the chat was brief, it was sufficient. He seemed sincere, and I had the impression that things were at last beginning to improve at that precise moment. Over the next few weeks, things kept getting better. I no longer felt like I was bearing the burden of the home by myself. Once my parents and I established a new routine, they began to assist more, cleaning, helping with groceries, and generally showing me respect for my personal space. Although it wasn't flawless, it was a significant step up from our previous situation. After they departed, I didn't hear much from Jake and Emma. According to my mom, they were looking for a place of their own and were spending some time in a motel. I refrained from prying. Even though I adored my brother, I needed him to learn how to be independent, so I had set clear limits. I'd be happy to stay away for a while if that meant it. About a month after the entire incident, Jake texted me one afternoon. It was succinct and direct, not his typical tone, but it sounded genuine. "Hey, I understand that things went wrong. I simply wanted to apologize for the way things turned out. I hope we can speak soon as we work things out." I looked at the message for a long time, unsure of how to react. A part of me was grateful for the gesture, but another part of me was still upset about how everything had turned out. I took a while to respond. It took me longer to process. I took some time that evening to write a response, attempting to be polite, yet explicit about my position. "I appreciate the message. I'm happy that you two are working things out. I need some time, but I hope we can communicate soon as well. When both of us are ready, let's catch up." A weird sensation of closure came over me as I pushed send. Even though I didn't expect things to be flawless, at least we could communicate once more. A few weeks ago, that was more than I could have imagined. I started to feel more at ease with everything. As time passed, my parents were finally accepting my boundaries, and there was no longer any tension in the house. Above all, I regained my sense of control over my life and my personal space. The journey here was not simple. One of the most difficult things I had ever had to do was to stand up for myself, especially when it meant going against my family. However, it was ultimately worthwhile. I had gained an important lesson. Even in your own family, respect is you have to earn. It is not something you can demand. I had earned mine, too. In retrospect, I'm happy I didn't give up. It would have been simple to give in and let Jake and Emma take over my room, to allow my parents to continue to manage the house as if I were a visitor. I didn't want that life, though. I'd long for my own personal space and dignity, and suddenly I had both. Perhaps Jake and Emma's situation will change in the future. Perhaps we'll be close as we were before all of this drama. However, for the time being, I'm only concerned with living my life as I need to, and for the first time in a long time, that feels sufficient.